beginning chapter 8 in Dreams, Evolution, and Value Fulfillment by Jane Roberts, a Seth book. Volume 2. Titled When You Are Who You Are, The Worlds of Imagination and Reason, and the Implied Universe. So Seth states, when you are determines where you are. Space is in many ways more, quote, timely than you think. I am not speaking of the usual time concepts, of course, of consecutive moments, but of a certain dimension of activity in which your space happens. As long as we are trying to explain the origin of your world in a new fashion, we will be bringing in many subjects that may not usually appear in such discussions. The world, as you know it, emerges from an inner, more extensive sphere of dimensions into actuality. It is supported then by a seemingly invisible framework. Beyond certain levels, it is almost meaningless to speak in terms of particles, but I will for now use the term, in quotes, invisible particles, because you are familiar with it. Invisible particles, then, form the foundation of your world. The invisible particles that I am referring to, however, have the ability to transform themselves into mass, or to divest themselves of it. And the invisible particles of which I speak not only possess consciousness, but each one is, if you will, a seed that contains within itself a potential for an infinite number of gestalts. Each such invisible particle contains within itself the potential to embark upon an infinite number of probable variations of consciousness. To that degree, such psychological particles are at that stage unspecialized, while they contain within themselves the innate ability to specialize in whatever direction becomes suitable. They can be, and they are, everywhere at once. Sometimes they operate with mass and sometimes without it. Now you are composed of such invisible particles, and so is everything else that you can physically perceive. To that degree, portions of your own consciousness are everywhere at once. They are not lost or spread out in some generalized fashion, but acutely responsive, and as highly alert as your familiar consciousness is now. The self that you are aware of represents only one, quote, position in which those invisible particles happen to intersect, gain mass, build up form. Scientists can only perceive an electron as it is to them. They cannot really track it. They cannot be certain of its position and its speed at the same time. And to some extent, the same applies to your consciousness. The speed of your own thoughts takes those thoughts away from you even as you think them. And you can never really examine a thought, but only the thought of a thought. Because you are everywhere at once. I am quite aware of the fact that you can scarcely follow that psychological motion. As we will see later, your imaginations can lead you towards some recognition, even towards some emotional comprehension of this concept. While your reasoning abilities at first may falter, that is only because you have trained your intellect to respond in a limited fashion. There are what I will call, quote, intervals of perception. You are usually conscious of events that are significant neurologically, and that neurological timing is the end result of an almost infinite series of sequences. Those sequences are areas in which activities happen. Each consciousness within each area is tuned into its proper sequence. Each area builds on the others. The invisible particles are the framework upon which your body is formed. For example, they move faster than the speed of light, yet you are not dizzy. You are aware of no such motion. You are tuned into a different sequence of action. There are then different worlds operating with different frequencies at different intervals. They are conscious in other times. Though you are neurologically equipped to perceive your own interval structures. When I speak of time, I do not merely refer to other centuries as you think of them, but between the moments that you know and neurologically accept, there are other kinds of moments, if you prefer other versions of time, and other kinds of accomplishments and fulfillments that are not dependent upon your usual ideas of, say, growth through time. Some of this may seem quite difficult at first reading, but I know that you are all far more intelligent than you realize you are, far more intuitive. I also know that you are tired of simple tales told to you as if you were children, and that your minds and hearts yearn for worthwhile challenges. You want to extend yourselves as far as possible, because each of you has been born with that urge toward value fulfillment. It is only because, particularly in your times, you have trained yourselves to limit the nature of your own consciousnesses, that such ideas seem strange. You have thus far believed that you must train your great imaginations and your intelligences to confine themselves and their activities to the physical world as you have been told it exists. In childhood, before you so leashed your imaginations, however, you each had your own dreams that awakened you to other portions of your own identities. There are many experiences open to you now, if you can be free enough to allow them, that will give you glimpses of those other intervals in which you have a reality. I will deal with some such exercises later on in the book. All such methods, however, are useless if your beliefs hold you back, and so the main thrust of all my books is to increase your own areas of thought and speculation. In material like tonight's, but in general during sessions, you end up with information that does indeed come from outside of time in certain important fashions. It requires that Rupert forge imagination and reason together in a highly accelerated fashion, and at levels obviously not conscious in usual terms, levels that propel him into my domain. I have my own consciousness at other intervals, intervals that in your terms encompass your own. Now Rupert is undergoing some profound therapeutic changes. Probabilities intersect at each point with your time, and those probabilities are psychologically directed so that, in your terms once again, he is at an excellent intersection point where the prognosis is excellent. Tell him I said this, and you are both responsible, for both of your lives merge in their fashions. Rob adds, I had several other questions concerning Seth's use of the term, quote, invisible particles, but decided to discuss them with Jane later. Okay, so that discussion with Jane later actually really upset Jane, which is kind of funny because when you go into the next session, it explains how Rob was onto something. Okay, so I'm going to read this now and not in the next part where Rob's making his pre-session notes. And it refers back to the invisible particles that Seth was talking about just now. And it says, last night, as I began typing Monday's 915th session, I asked Jane why Seth hadn't just called his, quote, invisible particles CUs, or units of consciousness, as he'd done earlier in Dreams. That would be Volume 1. And as he'd always done in his other books. The question upset her, especially when I added that I was afraid Seth was repeating old material under a new term. In order to help Jane feel better, I speculated that he must have had his reasons for doing this, and that of course a certain amount of repetition is necessary in each book in a series. The restatements not only furnish a foundation for new material, but enable each book to be complete in itself. After all, I said, I tried to achieve those same goals with the notes. Okay, so then it goes into Rob's note stating, Jane received material from Seth in which he very nicely explained his use of invisible particles. And since tonight he goes into his reasons for doing so, there's no need to give them here. Of course, we were both relieved. And of course, Seth hadn't been concerned. The next session, starting with Seth saying, when Joseph, as Seth calls me, read the last session, he wondered whether or not the invisible particles I referred to were the same as the units of consciousness I've spoken of before. He was supposed to ask the question, and so was each reader. For one thing, while I realize the importance of specific terms, I do not want you as a reader to become so dependent upon terms that coming across one you have read before, you instantly categorize it. For another thing, each time I reintroduce such information, I do so from another direction, so to speak, so that you, as a reader, are meant to approach it from a different angle also. In that way, you become familiar with certain knowledge from a variety of viewpoints. As you read those passages, the question itself, quote, are these, after all, the units of consciousness referred to earlier, end quote, should have triggered your intellect and your intuition to work together, even if only slightly in another way. In other words, of course, I hope to inspire both your imagination and your intelligence in this chapter and in this section of the book, devoted to such subject matter. Remember, again, the manifest universe emerges from a subjective reality, one that is implied in the very nature of your world itself. I would like you then to think of those units of consciousness from an entirely different scale of events. Imagine now, as far as you are able, the existence of all that is, a consciousness so magnificently complex that what we may call its own psychological compartments are, literally now, infinite. All appearances of time and all experience of it must be psychological. The, quote, speed of electrons, for example, would reflect their psychological motion. All that is, as the source of realities and experience, is so psychologically complex, so multidimensionally creative, that it constantly surprises itself. It is itself the invisible universe that is everywhere implied within your world, but that becomes manifest to your perception only through historic time. All that is disperses itself, therefore, so that it is, on the one hand, quote, a massive subjective entity, a psychological structure, and on the other hand, it also disperses itself into the phenomenal world. It is, in all meanings of the word, divine. yet it disperses even that divinity, so that in your terms, each unit of consciousness contains within itself those properties of divinity. All that is has no one image, but is within all images, whether or not they are manifest. Your thoughts are the invisible partners of your words, and the vast, unstated subjectivity of all that is in the same way behind all stated or manifest phenomena. In those terms, it is basically impossible for any given species to become extinct. It can disappear for a time, become unmanifest for a while in historic events. The genetic patterns for any given species reside, of course, primarily in that species' genetic bank, but that genetic bank does not exist in isolation, but is invisibly connected with the genetic makeup of each other species. There are countless relationships between species that go unrecognized. The generations of all species interact. The genetic cues are not triggered on the proposition, obviously, that a species exists alone on the planet, but also in response to genetic sequences that operate in all of the species combined. The genetic system, again, is not closed nearly as much as supposed. That is, again, because the basic units of consciousness that build up matter, that form matter, are themselves endowed with a subjective acuteness. This also accounts for my earlier statement that, in usually understood terms, the environment and its creatures, quote, evolve together. Your position on the scale of awareness inclines you to categorize consciousness so that only your own familiar brand seems to fit the definition. So, again here, I remind you that consciousness is everywhere in the deepest terms, because all that is disperses itself throughout physical reality. All portions of that reality have their own rights to existence and purposes within it. So, of course, do all peoples and the races. Your imaginations help you bring elements of that inner implied universe into actuality. Your imaginations, obviously, are not limited by time. You can imagine past and future events. Your imaginations have always helped you form your civilizations, your arts, and your sciences, and when they are united with your reasoning processes, they can bring you knowledge about the universe and your places in it that you can receive in no other fashion. Rob asks, what are you going to do for the rest of the evening? He's asking Seth. Seth replies, I am going to refresh myself by diving into some new concepts. For there are new concepts for me also, of course, and I dive into them from many positions all the time as well. And then notes on that comment from Seth. Seth had given us insights into the nature of his own reality. I told Jane now that he'd offered us another hint tonight. His statement is particularly intriguing because Seth indicated that in his non-physical reality, quote, wherever that is, end quote, he's still developing, just as we are, quote, here on Earth, end quote. I added that I'd certainly like him to comment sometime on those new concepts he's about to explore. And then from the last session, session 9:15, Seth states, quote, there are systems in which a moment from your standpoint is made to endure for the life of a universe. I do not mean that a moment is simply stretched or that time is slowed down alone, but that all the experiences possible within a moment become realities within that framework, end quote. That was obviously from Volume 1. Nice little reminder.